Right, so for all the talk of a ceasefire deal to end the atrocities in Gaza, so much of the emphasis has been on getting Israel to agree to terms. But suppose we could cut Israel out of the equation entirely. Why not consider this? It's certainly what campaigners in the US right now are demanding of Genocide Joe Biden and his overtly pro-Israel administration, because it is no longer a secret that Benjamin Netanyahu has been consistently doing all he can to scupper any chance of a peace deal, any chance of a ceasefire every time new rounds of talks begin, or indeed show any sign of progressing. Perhaps Biden and his even more ardently Zionist Secretary of State Antony Blinken are deluding themselves otherwise. Perhaps not. But those campaigning to see an end to this, those whose loved ones may be amongst those people still held by Hamas, they see Netanyahu for what he is now, and what he is doing, and his motivations for doing so at that, being completely self-serving. So is there a route through this that doesn't actually need Israel at all? Because if so, surely it would be obvious that this is now the greatest chance of success. Right, so this is an interesting conundrum that I certainly hadn't considered before in the terms it's being presented in now. But is there a route to a peace deal in the Middle East that cuts Israel out of the equation entirely? Protesters in the United States evidently think so, and are demanding Biden begin thinking in similar terms. Of the hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza, several have family in America. Not much of a surprise, perhaps, given how many Jewish Americans have settled in Israel, as is their right to do under Israeli law, despite not necessarily having an ounce of Semitic blood in their veins, unlike Palestinians who absolutely do, but in their case have no right of return. Israel, the apartheid state, right there in black and white. But we're not going to dig into that in this video now. Regardless of whether it's Israeli citizens or Palestinian ones right now, there are many voices on both sides who want an end to this genocide. Israelis and indeed families such as the ones I've mentioned in America want their family members back. Palestinians just want a chance to put their lives back together. Netanyahu's actions are not answering the calls on either side of that divide. It's all about him. Me, keeping his government together and doing whatever is best for himself personally now. The US, in no uncertain terms, continues to basically cede to Netanyahu each time, despite peace talks being repeatedly collapsed as he changes negotiator remits or makes demands that are impossible to agree to, such as he is doing right now, demanding Israel remain in the Philadelphia corridor on the border between Gaza and Egypt, in defiance, as that is, of peace accords Israel has held with Egypt since 1979. Of the hostages still held by Hamas that we believe are still alive, 4 of them are indeed American. Their families no longer believe Netanyahu will commit to any agreement to see their families freed, and there are some in the US administration allegedly saying likewise. And so these families have made a new demand of Joe Biden: seek a solution that doesn't involve Israel. It puts the Biden administration on the back foot somewhat. It's a little bit of a nightmare for them. They have very little by way of links to Hamas themselves, having to go through intermediary countries such as Egypt or Qatar, as that would take to bring them to the table. And equally, there's little willpower for them to have anything to do with Hamas anyway. The Israel lobby, AIPAC, they speak louder. Their money speaks louder. And it is why publicly they speak out in regard to peace talks in language that demands Hamas make concessions, that Hamas sign up to whatever deal is being presented, even though Hamas have a track record of actually agreeing to terms previously, and it is Israel that has repeatedly not done so. This has clearly not escaped the families of those 4 American hostages either. Otherwise, why make the request of their government instead of seeking an agreement with Hamas and cutting Israel and Netanyahu out of this? The optics are horrendous for the Biden government, the US government as well. Imagine negotiating with Hamas for the release of hostages while still insisting on arming Israel, for instance. You can imagine what Hamas would want in return for the hostage releases as well. America stand by international humanitarian law for one thing, which they clearly are not doing for as long as they continue to keep arming Israel. But the leverage it would give to Hamas, this would be off the charts. Full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and the West Bank? Seems reasonable. Cessation of arms supplies to Israel? Well, that seems fair as well. Their own hostages released from Israeli prisons? Well, why not? Support for Palestinian state recognition at the UN Security Council and stop using that veto? Oh, that'd put the cat amongst the pigeons, wouldn't it? They'd be the basics, surely. But for Americans, would they entertain the idea? Let's look at it another way. Biden right now is being shamed relentlessly over his reaction, or lack thereof, in the condemnation of Israel over the death of Ayşenur Ezgiaga, the 26-year-old American-Turkish dual citizen, at Israeli hands. She was killed by Israel. But this means, therefore, that there has to be a gathering of the facts exercise, according to Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State and Israel's biggest apologist, going it seems. And what will those facts end up telling us? Where, if it was Hamas, though, and indeed Kamala Harris made a prat of herself the other day over this, referring to Hamas as an evil terrorist organisation who had American blood on their hands, there needs to be no fact-finding before condemnation is made there, does there? Well, if anything happens to the 4 hostages Hamas currently hold, American hostages, when their families are asking you to deal with Hamas because Israel are bad faith brokers, and indeed the dead captive Harris was alluding to in her little rant there, one of the 6 hostages, largely it is alleged not deceased by Hamas's hands but thanks to an Israeli airstrike, it makes the US look even more biased and stupid than they already do. And in fact, it was in the aftermath of this tragedy that those American families have come forward and said this can't go on, Israel won't budge, they are bad faith brokers, there needs to be a change in approach, cut Israel out. But, that is a very big but, the US has a huge leverage issue with Hamas, in that they don't have any. It is the US, therefore, who would have to make the significant concessions, and their rhetoric would definitely have to change. They'd have to prove they were trustworthy to Hamas of all people. And they wouldn't be able to do that without bringing in help on such matters such as I mentioned before, Egypt or Qatar, to vouch for them in some way. Would they be prepared to stick their necks out for the US without some sort of guarantee that the US would actually stand by it, given they are basically right now the most pro-Israel outside nation on the planet? Fundamentally, it requires binning the US position with Israel as it stands, completely, ending their special relationship, if you call it like that, if you like. And no US administration, Republican or Democrat, would do that because they're all too in hoc to the Israel lobby. It also shows what a failed neoliberal institution the US electoral system has inflicted on that country, that it cannot or will not work in the interests of their own citizens to get their own people back, when the relationship with Israel, with all the ties that come with that, clearly ends up coming first. When you boil all of this down, ultimately it should be American citizens being put first by America, getting them back safely. And the hand-wringing the US is now doing shows what a corner they've been backed into by this, what a nightmare this is for them. Because the last thing they want to do is jeopardise the relationship with Netanyahu's genocidal apartheid state. Yet it is exactly what needs to be done, what has to be done, what should be done in order to get these hostages back, if that's clearly what Biden does, if he's going to pay any attention to the families that are pleading to him now. The stakes now are so high because if they don't prioritise their own citizens over this, what does that tell America about the people who want to run the country? Who are they running the country for? Because it's clearly not the people voting for them. Not a good message, is it? Frankly, the US and the Genocide Joe administration deserve to be in the fix they are in. And they damn well need to be held to account when, as I feel, they inevitably will not budge an inch and fail these American hostages and their families even more. As if there wasn't ample reason already for the US to pull the plug on Israel over the war crimes it has committed, crimes they may well find themselves complicit in yet, given time. Amnesty International have just released a report detailing yet another war crime being committed by Israel, one that has taken months of investigation on their part to establish, but which is, as usual, going grossly underreported in our media. Well, not by this channel, it isn't. Check out the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.